Hey, everybody. Hope you're doing well. As you can see, we have a little visitor in class today. I thought I'd let him hang out, though. He seemed kind of interested in the topic. Oh, he's saying something to me. Oh, what's that? We're going to not have discussion section next Wednesday? Wow. Okay. It was his idea. We're not going to have discussion section next Wednesday, so you get a break. It's been a rough quarter for everybody, including Penguins. And I think we're probably going to have enough material to cover overall. So next Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving, no discussion section. All right. Don't thank me, thank the Penguin. All right. Everything else okay? Any questions on anything? Let's see here. Yeah, we're good. Okay. So we're going to continue talking about faces today, and then start talking about hearing and speech perception and multisensory perception over the last three lectures. Hopefully we'll finish faces today. But this face stuff I think is so cool. It's worth spending some time, extra time on. So we'll cover some of the most interesting aspects of it. So let's get right to it then. This is where we left off. And just to remind you of the big picture here, which is always a good thing to do. Oh, if somebody wants to ask about the transcript, I'll click that on. Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. Good. All right. So let's get the big picture here again. Yes, we are talking about face perception because I think it's really cool, and there's some wonderful findings in there, and I think it's kind of addresses some of the most interesting aspects of how research in kind of simple behavioral responses, perceptual responses, also kind of connects to imaging and what we understand going on in the brain. There's lots of research in both of those domains. So it's a great topic on its own, but we're also using the topic to ask this kind of more general question about speciality in the brain, whether for some types of functions, some classes of stimuli, such as faces, whether there's something special in the brain that can be dedicated to it. Because this is something that's been considered for forever, and is still being considered in various ways in modern perception and cognition and general psychology. Whether the brain has specialized mechanisms to deal with a certain type of function, right? Or should we think of the brain as having kind of general processes that can apply to many, many different types of stimuli? And I think it's probably nowhere more kind of fleshed out than in face perception research, which is why we're using it to discuss that general topic. And so we introduced the notion of modularity. And we're introducing modularity kind of in its most rigid format, meaning that we're looking at criteria that would define something as a specialization in the brain, including, of course, an anatomical specialization, but it has to be a lot more than that. We'd have to find, for it to really be a specialization, it has to have a functional specialization, meaning that potentially there's processes that are used that are different for processes that would be used for other types of stimuli. Are there special types of processes reserved for face perception? And then we talked about other aspects of this modularity sort of idea, one of which is that we wouldn't want a module for everything, right? We wouldn't want a module, as I said, for cell phones and tin cans and things like that. We want a module for something that's evolutionarily very important, like faces, right? Because there's so much information we can get from faces. It seems like such an important part of our environment, of our niche, right? And so it would make sense, if we were going to have a specialization, that faces would be one of the things we'd have a specialization for. And we've been kind of establishing that, yeah, faces are so important to what happens with us perceptually and for our survival and everyday actions. And that's kind of how we've been introducing these topics of attractiveness, And we'll be talking about expression soon, and what other things have we talked about? Yeah, I guess we started talking about it. Attractiveness is one of the first things. So, kind of establishing that attractiveness is some ways more important than we wish it was, right? We don't like to think of ourselves as very superficial, thinkers or behaviors or anything like that. We like to think of ourselves as deeper, but yeah, facial attractiveness does have a strong bearing on lots of things, including professional success, how parents interpret infants and children, mating selection, all those sorts of things. And then we also talked about some kind of cultural and historical universals that kind of establish what an attractive face is. Again, suggesting that, yeah, no matter how we want to think of ourselves as deep kind of, rational intellectual creatures, there's something kind of primary about an attractive face that does, affect our behavior, and whatever those characteristics are, there do seem to be some that are culturally universal. So we all have different tastes and who we find attractive and all that sort of thing, of course, but there are some universals, at least across the kind of the big picture, including things like youthfulness and averageness, as we discussed. Signals that a person is genetically healthy and can have genetically healthy offspring. So that's the term fitness that I've been kind of alluding to, that faces provide information for fitness. They do so in a way through their attractiveness. Okay, so let's continue talking about the evolutionary importance of faces in the context now, though, of expression. And when we introduce this idea, we discuss this as perceiving the intent in the person. So as we're interacting with people, how do we interpret what they intend towards us, what they are experiencing, and how that might affect our interactions with them? Right. So, you've probably learned a little bit about this in other classes. Very often it's standard intro psychology sort of stuff. And you may have seen faces like this in that discussion. Whenever I look at these faces, yes, it is relatively easy to interpret the expressions or the emotions these expressions are supposed to convey: happiness and surprise. And what is that? Disgust. My penguin's covering up the pictures a little bit. Disappointment, sadness, fear, anger, right? Those are the classic things. But it's really funny. If you watch people interact, they rarely actually have expressions that dramatic. And there's been some controversy over these sort of kind of posed expressions in the research. So historically, these are exactly the sort of stimuli that were shown to people who were asked for their interpretation of the expression, but they aren't very normal expressions, right? They aren't the sort of expressions that we typically do when we're interacting with somebody, when we're interacting with our friends. Yeah, some of it, maybe a smile when we're laughing and that sort of thing, but how often have you actually had that expression since you were a kid, right? Sadness is expressed in more subtle ways typically, right? And is this what happens when you get angry at somebody? It's hard to say. These are almost kind of like exaggerated versions of our normal expressions. So when these sorts of images are presented to people across cultures, because that's one of the things that's done with these sorts of images. You present these images to people here in Southern California. You present these pictures to folks that haven't experienced much of Western culture. I think Papua New Guinea is one of the classic locations, and see if they are interpreting the images the same. And you may have heard some of this research that there are certain expressions that seem to be universal. So a smile is a smile all over the world. But as it turns out, it is not that clear cut, partly because of the sort of images that are being shown here, which are not very natural. But there do seem to be some cultural universals, some, not probably as much as you may have been taught in intro psychology. I'm not sure how up to date that research is that is presented there. Yeah, there do seem to be things like Smiles are interpreted more or less as expressions of some sort of a positive emotion across different cultures. But the type of positive emotion and the type of smile that actually is typically seen in different cultures varies. So you may have noticed this before. It's something that I'm very aware of, I guess, because I'm a perceptual psychologist to some degree. But I remember, traveling. I did a sabbatical years ago in England, and I grew up in kind of a rural part of New York State, far away from New York City, kind of farmland. And people up there were very kind of emotive, their expressions were very kind of, I don't know if I want to say exaggerated, but they were very, very clear. Maybe not this exaggerated, but they were very, very clear. I remember being in London during my sabbatical, and looking at folks on the train, interacting with each other and that sort of thing. And certainly they were very, very interactive and all that, but the types of expressions that one would see there were much more constrained. I don't know if you've seen, interviews with the Queen, or it's that sort of thing where, yes, the Queen expresses happiness with her face, but it's a much more kind of restrained sort of happiness. And that's a lot of what I was seeing in London. And then my wife and I went and did some traveling outside of London. We went to rural areas outside in England, and then went to Scotland. And in rural areas, the expressions were much more, kind of amplified. They were, a smile was much, much broader than it was in London. And you see this sort of thing where often in big cities, expressions, for whatever reason, tend to be a little bit more constrained than they are in rural areas of a country. This differs in different countries, of course, but it is kind of this pattern you see. And it's not just smiles are bigger in rural parts of country, but other expressions as well. And you may have also noticed that for folks that are, immigrants or something from different countries, the expressions seem to kind of have a different set of, I don't know, almost rules or something. And in fact, these are called display rules that, we do see some cultural universals about happiness, how happiness is expressed. But you may have noticed this very simply, that different people from different cultures smile more or less broadly. They have a either more kind of restrained smile or a more kind of exaggerated smile. And that's what display rules are. By the way, you saw display rules as one of your distractor items last class. That's what they are. They're kind of the rules that get imposed on how expressions are conveyed, and how kind of exaggerated the expressions are, with some evidence that, you do see folks living in cities having more restrained expressions than folks living rurally. So it's this, the strength of the expression differs depending on kind of cultural differences. But you do see some universals, meaning that, it is probably the case that a smile is a smile to some degree. In most places around the world, people can interpret that more or less. So that is true. However, so a positive emotion would be generally considered positive across cultures. And negative emotions would too, but here's where things get a little bit more complicated, where this might right here, this I guess is disgust, which is a negative emotion, might be interpreted as disgust here in Southern California. It might be interpreted as anger in another culture, and where this might be disgust in that culture, right? So I guess these would all be, most of these, I guess, are negative emotions. Certainly these 3 on the bottom and these 2 to the side here. And they would all be interpreted as negative, as some negative emotion across cultures, but which negative emotions they are might differ across cultures, right? So maybe this is disgust or sadness, Maybe, you know, this would be anger, as I said. And so there is a universality, it seems, with expression, but that universality is not as precise as it's typically portrayed in your intro classes, or you might expect. Not these 7 kind of basic emotions are not all universal across the cultures. What's universal is, you know, what we consider a general positive emotion. And by the way, this is supposed to be positive surprise here, but okay. There is some swapping within the classes like that. But clearly, regardless of which culture and regardless of the display rules, it's very clear that expression perception is a critical part of our perceptual skills, right? So I think you'll find this really interesting. What I'm going to talk about now is how expressions, how perception of facial expressions seems so important for the brain that they can actually have an effect. Expressions can have an effect over our behavior, even when we're unaware of seeing an expression. Okay, let me just take a quick look in the chat here. Okay. Yes. Melinda says, I'm just going to go through these now very quickly. It's similar in Eastern European culture, Romanian culture, expressions are very constrained. That's interesting. Thank you. That's a really interesting thing. I'll look for that. Thank you. When I went to visit my grandparents, Maimuna says, when I went to visit my grandparents in Pakistan, I noticed that everyone there doesn't smile with their teeth. Yeah, and that's also the case, I think, in England. You saw very few teeth during smiling. It's cultural, and also because the healthcare system, because many people don't have. Yeah, that was I think the original reason that you didn't see teeth often in England. I'm not sure why you still see that, but that is the case. Yeah, they don't have the type of dental care. Interesting. That's a great example of that. So there's an instance where there's another kind of reason for the constraint. Yeah. Is the same thing, Sarah asks, is the same thing as in India where nodding and shaking your head meant no and yes. Yeah. It is exactly that type of thing. It's interesting, Sarah. I think that the nodding yes and no is different across cultures, but I think you see more consistency for whatever reason in something like that than you do in the extremity of facial expressions. That's interesting. Something I remember. Yeah, okay. I'm not sure how true that is. So I guess there's some consideration of how true that nodding thing is, but okay. But yes, it would be along the same lines, Sarah. Thank you for asking that. Okay, so let's go now though and talk about subliminally perceived faces. So this is like the methodology I talked about last class, where as far as you know, you would be asked to concentrate on a stimulus that was being presented to you on a computer screen long enough for you to make a judgment on it. All right, so let's see here. I think I have a picture of this. Yeah, kind of ignore this for now. But yeah, there's I guess a Chinese character. I'm sorry, I don't know if that's truly a Chinese character or not. But remember, I did mention these last class. That you're sitting in a computer screen and maybe you see a flash, or maybe it seems like a little glitch in the monitor. Maybe you notice nothing at all. But then what comes up is this character, Chinese character. And as we discussed for the attractiveness stimuli, you're asked to now judge the aesthetic appeal, the attractiveness of this Chinese character. Okay. And you say, oh, that's kind of a nice looking one. I don't know. I give it a 7 out of 10 or whatever. And maybe there'll be some that are even nicer looking, some that are less nice looking. Okay, that's fine. But unbeknownst to you, what you are being presented before you see that character is a super quick flash of a face expressing an emotion, right? We talked about this last class as a face that was either attractive or unattractive. The face now is either expressing an emotion of happiness or sadness. Now, again, you are completely unaware of seeing a face. You might be aware of seeing a flash on the screen. It doesn't really make too much of a difference. No one recognizes a face because it's being presented so quickly. However, the fact that it is being presented at all allows your brain to process it, in this case unconsciously, so it influences your judgment of the aesthetic appeal of the figure, of the character. So if you see a sad face before you see that character, you're less likely to find that character appealing. If you see a happy face flash to you too quickly to notice, you would find that character more appealing. Okay, so a subliminal, not just subliminal in this case, just means it's a below your, kind of threshold of awareness. A subliminally presented stimulus will influence judgments on another stimulus that is, conscious, noticeably presented. So that's the first thing. It influences aesthetic judgments. The other thing it influences is hypothetical decisions. So let's kind of switch the experiment a little bit. You're still sitting in front of a computer screen, and you are now asked for your decision. What would your action be given a hypothetical situation? All right, so you're told a story, say, or a scenario. You're given a scenario that you're walking down a city street here, and you're, it's late at night. There's nobody else around. Then all of a sudden, you see somebody coming down the street, walking towards you, a dark, kind of shadow walking towards you. And the question is, do you now go to the other side of the street, to be safer potentially, or do you feel comfortable to stay on the side of the street you're currently on? Okay, we all have different feelings about that, but this is the interesting part. You're going to be shown a picture of that scenario, like something like this. But before you're shown that picture, and after you're given the description of the scenario, you're presented a super fast image of a face either smiling or showing anger. Okay, it's probably the same image, same person in both images, but that doesn't make much of a difference to your conscious awareness because you don't even notice that there's a face there at all. You know where this is going. If you in fact see a face smiling, then you will be less likely to say that you would cross the street away from the person who's walking towards you. If, on the other hand, the face was showing some sort of anger or some sort of threat, even though you're not conscious of seeing the face, it would probably induce you to say, I guess I'd probably cross the street to be safe. So again, what we're trying to convince you of here is that facial expressions are so important to your brain that even when your conscious awareness is not processing it, your unconscious brain is processing it and having and integrating that into what your next behavior, your next aesthetic judgment might be. Okay, so that's how kind of critical it is to your perceptual skills. And then finally, mood. There is a little evidence. It's very subtle. I don't want you to go out and spend money on any system that suggests that looking at happy faces will make you happy for the day, because it doesn't last that long. But yeah, subliminally presented happy faces seem to elevate your mood just a tiny bit, and subliminally presented sad faces seem to depress your mood just a tiny bit. Now, again, these are subtle effects. Say on a scale from 1 to 10, how good a mood are you in right now? And if you're saying, okay, having a normal day, I'd say 6 or 7, whatever. Maybe it would knock it to 7 or 8 if you saw a happy face. And then if you saw a sad face, maybe it'd knock it to 5 or 6 or something like that. They're very subtle effects. Okay. It doesn't happen to work for everybody, and it's very short-lived, right? After an hour, you're then asked the same question, and what your mood is and that sort of thing. And if you had seen the happy or sad face an hour earlier, it probably no longer has an effect, right? That being said, smiling at people and getting a smile back certainly, I think, probably helps us, cheer up a little bit in certain situations. So it's not, it's not a bad idea. So, let a smile be your umbrella, a smile on the whole world, smile back, all that stuff that your parents and teachers told you, that there is a, kernel of scientific truth there to some degree. That being said, I would not go out and spend money. There are, I guess, programs you can, pay for on the internet that would, show you subliminally presented happy faces and whatever. It's a short-lived sort of effect. So it's now just smile at people. It's a good thing to do. All right. Cool. Oh yes, this is really cool too. This actually is related to what I was just discussing with regard to smiling at people and having them smile back. Well, it turns out that return smile, and sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't, in some ways happens automatically. It happens automatically in a very subtle manner. So these are experiments now where subjects are asked to look at a computer screen, and maybe we'll start with these experiments where they're actually asked to look at faces and judge something about their age, maybe. Okay, so a face comes up on the computer screen, and you're supposed to, push a, button. Are they between 20 and 30, 30 and 40, 40 and 50, whatever? Okay, one of the three buttons. It's actually a distractor test, because here's the cool thing. What is happening as the subject is making this judgment is they are being filmed. Okay, and that's actually what you're seeing right here. You're seeing subjects right here. Let's look at this image right here. Okay, you're just looking at the bottom half of a subject who's performing this on a computer, performing this task on a computer. They're just looking at faces and categorizing each face's age. Okay, they're at their best guess. Okay, but some of the faces they're going to see are going to be smiling, and some of them are not going to be smiling. When the faces are smiling, what is often seen is a kind of reflexive, automatic imitation of the smile. So here the person is looking at a face that's in a neutral expression and judging the age. Here they're looking at a different face, and that face happens to be smiling. And again, they're not looking at the smile for the task. They're just, judging the age in the same way. Okay, but what you will see is kind of this inadvertent kind of smile response. Now, it's not always that overt. So it is not always the case that you will see a smile on a person's face who's looking at a smiling face. But there's other ways you can measure this. You can actually record muscle movements from the muscles involved in smiling, right? So there's EMG. It's a very easy thing to do. You just like put little stickers with wires around the person's mouth. It's not invasive really. And you give them a cover story about what you're doing here. Maybe you put stickers with wires on other parts of the face, but you can record muscle activity here very, very easily with no, nothing's going into muscles or into the skin or anything like that. And you then see if when a person looks at a smiling face, whether their smile muscles, the smiles they use to create their own smile, are actually activated. And yes, you do see that occur. And all this happens, whether it's visibly noticeable, like it is in this particular case, or it might be too subtle, still the smile muscles are activated. That not only works for positive emotions, it also works for negative emotions. So this is now showing a subject looking at the same types of faces, and hold on a second, sorry, and doing the same thing, judging the age of the faces. But in this case, some of the faces are actually frowning. They're kind of looking concerned. And what you will see, and it's very subtle here, is you will see a kind of an imitative, a kind of a reflexive imitated furrowing of the brow. So they're trying to show that the subject here is kind of pulling their eyebrows in a little bit, which is an imitation of the face that they're seeing, the expression that they're seeing. And again, it might not be visible to the eye. It might have to be recorded through these EMG, these muscular changes, but it is a pretty consistent type of finding. Okay, so this notion that, smile and the whole world smiles back, yeah, sometimes you might not notice it, But when you smile at somebody, you're actually inducing some subtle changes in their smile muscles. Same thing when you're frowning at somebody, right? Not only does this occur when the subjects are, looking at a face that's being presented for a second or so, or a few seconds, and making judgments on it. If the faces are in fact presented subliminally again, right, like we saw in these other experiments, right? So there's a cover story about what they're supposed to do. You do see reflexive imitation of expression with faces that aren't even noticeable, faces that subjects aren't even aware of seeing, right? So that's kind of, again, how important the brain kind of, I guess, uses faces. It uses faces that it doesn't even know it's seeing consciously, and it's having an effect over judgments, hypothetical scenarios, and also the reflexive kind of inadvertent expression imitation that you see with individuals not knowing they're even looking at faces. Now, I'm a little hesitant to talk about this because there is some controversy, but I think right now the evidence is somewhat in favor that, in fact, it does seem to be some influence over emotion that is based on the imitation that occurs. Okay, so what do you do to determine this, right? So before I said that, you look at subliminally presented faces, or you look at smiling faces that are very obvious, does have some influence over emotion, is very subtle. It seems that this imitation that we do when we see a smiling face that we're unconscious of typically, that happens kind of reflexively, does have some bearing over how our mood changes. Okay, so you can actually constrain the muscles of the mouth so they can't do the imitation. It's a very simple thing to do. You can, ask somebody to hold a pen in their mouth or something. Okay, you can see the pen in my mouth, and when you do that, that kind of prevents those smile muscles from kind of doing the same thing that they're seeing the person do in the image they're being presented. If you do that, whatever sort of small elevation of mood that you typically see with seeing a smile face, that goes away. And there's other ways of doing that too. If you put a pen in a person's teeth rather than their mouth, it actually prevents the frowning muscles of the mouth to do the imitation. And it's the same type of thing, which is interesting. And we're not going to get too into it in this class, but this idea that imitation becomes an important part of our perceptual skills is a really interesting aspect of perceptual psychology. And it's really nicely portrayed in this face literature, I think, which is pretty cool. And so here's something you might find really interesting. There's been a lot in the news about Botox recently. I can't remember why. I was just looking at something, but individuals use Botox to look younger potentially. We discussed Botox a little bit when we were discussing the aesthetics of an attractive face being a younger face. So one of the things people do is they try to get rid of their wrinkles. They try to get rid of their laugh lines, their frown lines around their eyes and their mouth, by having Botox injected into their muscles. And what that does is kind of, I guess, it temporarily paralyzes the muscles. So those muscles don't necessarily move in the same way and won't kind of, fold the skin when you smile or frown. So it's a way of kind of preventing those wrinkles from happening. And yeah, it can be very effective. I have a close friend that does this, and it's you've seen probably Botox used poorly in photographs and stuff like that, but she has it done very professionally and you don't notice it. And she thinks that she looks younger, so it makes her feel better. So more power to her. But I had this discussion with her because this literature had just emerged about 5 years ago. Now, more than that, I guess, maybe 10 years ago, that showed that people who get Botox, yes, their expressions are a little constrained, But not only does it influence their own expression, their own facial expressions, it influences how they perceive other people's facial expressions. Now, before you think that's crazy, I mean, if that were the case, then people would never get Botox if they couldn't tell if somebody was smiling. It's a subtle effect. So it works something like this. You could use Photoshop, or maybe you have some app on your computer that could take a picture of a person that's smiling and then a picture of that same person frowning. And then you could, I don't think this is all that hard to do these days. You could set up maybe in a continuum of going from that happy face to that frowning face, right? And, you could, just set the computer, say, interpolate 6 faces in between the happy face and the smiling face. And I don't know how the program does it. Maybe it superimposes the 2 faces and shows one more dominant or something like that. But there'll be faces in the middle that are more ambiguous than the happy face of that person and the sad face of that same person, right? And, say you have now 8 faces, happy to sad, and you have a number of them that are more ambiguous in between. Most of us would be able to distinguish the very subtle differences in the kind of more ambiguous expressions. If I were to show you, face number 4 and face number 5, you'd be able to say this one's probably happier than this one. Face number 6 and face number 7, you'd say, yeah, this one's probably happier than that one. You could do that. When it comes to those subtleties, though, my friend who's had Botox injections would have much more trouble doing that, much more. They would have trouble distinguishing. So certainly she would say, that's a happy face, that's a sad face. But she would have more trouble distinguishing between these kind of fine gradations of facial expression. So it's a really interesting finding. It's kind of, when I told her about this, she said, oh my gosh, and clearly she knows when I'm smiling and frowning and my wife's smiling and frowning and all that sort of stuff. But there would be these subtle kind of inhibitions of her perceptual skill. Right. So it's, these injections have affected her muscles. There's no reason it should necessarily affect, her brain's perceptual ability, but it does. And the idea is that when we have to make very, kind of nuanced judgments of something like an expression, we probably involve our own kind of motor system in order to perceive that person's expressions. Right. And that's what I mean here by blinded by Botox. Yeah, you're not blinded, right? You can still see, you're seeing fine. You can see happy from sad, all that sort of stuff. But these small gradations, these kind of subtle nuances in expression are more difficult for people who've had Botox injections in their muscles. Okay, I thought you'd find that interesting. Cool. Let's take our little break here and do a practice question. Okay. All right, see if you guys have any questions. Okay. All right. Terrific. Let's do a question on, okay. This is actually going to be one that goes back to our discussion of modules that we had last class. And you might want to look back on that slide for the answer to this, and it is one of the harder questions that's going to be on your exam, your last exam during finals week. And so it's good to get the tough questions. And if you don't get this right, and I know many of you won't, that's okay. It'll allow us to review the topic, and you'll have a free question. It's about cognitive impenetrability. And the question is this: which of the following demonstrates cognitive impenetrability specifically? Okay, so what I'm going to show you now, or the responses all have to do with modularity, but one of them has to do with the particular characteristic of modules called cognitive impenetrability. Okay, and the question is, which of these supports that? A, we see faces in images that we know aren't faces. So like in mountain formations and cars, we know those things aren't faces, but we can't help but see faces in them. B, we have a specific part of the brain for face perception, that there might be part of the brain, fusiform gyrus, that responds to faces, it seems. Face perception, C, has high ecological or adaptive significance. Or D, we can perceive faces through multiple sensory channels, which supports cognitive impenetrability. Good luck. Again, just guess, don't worry about getting it right. I know this is a hard one. Give you another 10 seconds. I think it's actually one of the hardest questions on your exam, so it's good I'm giving this to you. Look how happy that penguin is. The penguin's happy because the majority of you got it right. More people got this one right than the others, responded to the correct answer than the incorrect answers. But I do know this is hard. The correct answer is A. We see faces as images that we know aren't faces. So let's go through the distractors first. So all of them are true, okay, and all of them are used as support for kind of a speciality of faces, a specialness of the face processing system, that we have a specific part of the brain for face perception. Yeah, there's evidence for that, and that's been used as evidence that we have a specialization for faces. It absolutely, as we're learning over the last few slides, yeah, it has very high ecological or adaptive significance, right? The brain seems to use attractiveness and expressions, even if we're unaware consciously. The brain needs that information and wants that information so badly, it doesn't care if we're conscious of seeing a face or not. We can perceive faces through multiple sensory channels, which we'll talk about hopefully today later on, which is also true, which is also used as evidence for modularity. But A, we see faces and images that we know aren't faces, kind of talks about the automaticity, or the fact that face perception for the brain seems so important that even if we are conscious of knowing that we're seeing something that's not a face, faces seem to kind of emerge out of these images, right? So like seeing faces in stains, seeing seeing faces in like Mars, or there's supposedly a face image on Mars that websites are dedicated to. Faces on the moon, faces in grilled cheese sandwiches. Even though consciously we have this knowledge, right, that we're not looking at a face, we can't help but see faces in there, suggesting that when it comes to perceiving faces, this process is impenetrable to our outside knowledge. And that's what cognitive impenetrability is about, right? So the correct answer is A, and you'll know this for the exam. So that's good, that's useful. It is one of the harder questions on the exam. Cool. All right, any questions on that or anything else we've been discussing? Okay, well, let's play a little game. Oh no, before we play a game, we got to go through this slide. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to go through this slide quickly. This just has to do with the development of face perception. You would think that if there was a kind of a specialization, an evolution was, part of creating that specialization, that in fact, it would be something, a skill that we would have very early in our development. And yeah, the evidence does really suggest that is the case. Hold on a second, let me get rid of that. Okay. So let's talk about this. Yes. By the time we are 9 minutes old, it seems that we can distinguish face patterns from patterns that are not face images, and that's just showing us very basically, if how long an infant will look at each of these different patterns. And as you can see here, an infant will look longer at a face image than it will any other type of image, comparable image at least. Even though an infant's visual system is not very good, the acuity is not good at all. They're seeing a pretty fuzzy world at that point. But at 9 minutes, you do see this kind of preference for faces. After 36 hours, you see the infant start to imitate expression. And oh shoot, sorry about that. The video, I guess, is not going to work for us. That's all right. At a 36-hour-old infant doesn't have a lot of control over its facial musculature, but you do see that if you put your face in front of an infant and stick your tongue out or make an O or smile, that the infant will kind of configure their face a little bit more in the direction of those expressions. Now, you don't see them, if they don't do this kind of reciprocal smile, like you smile and they smile back. Certainly that doesn't happen at 36 hours, but you might see the infant, I'm going to imitate an infant now, kind of looking around and doing lots of things with their faces, and they might go like that a little bit, like that. Okay. And they'll do it a little bit more if a smile is shown to them. It's that sort of thing. Okay. So you do see it at 36 hours, which is pretty amazing. At 1 to 3 months, they do recognize their parents through images. They are certainly recognizing their parents in many other ways before then, including voice and probably smell. But they can recognize photographs of their parents by the time they're 1 to 3 months old, just to give you some idea. And it does suggest overall a predisposition for faces, especially when you consider what an infant's acuity is like. This is not too long after they're born. This is after 1 month, this is 3 months, and this is adult acuity, just to give you a sense of what it's like. They don't have very much detail at all, but whatever detail they are able to focus, right, is enough for them to get a lot of information out of faces. And boy, does their brain want face information, right? It seems that there is this predisposition for faces. So we can conclude, and maybe there's nothing that surprising, but certainly all this evidence that we're talking about with regard to attractiveness, with regard to expression, with regard to development, does certainly point to faces having a profound ecological relevance, that they are critical. Our face perception is critical to our adaptive success, and it seems to be something that we're predisposed for. The brain wants as much facial information as it can get, including even when we're not consciously aware of it. Cool. Okay, let's move on. Here's our little game. Oh, sorry. My slide notes are different today. I'm sorry. So just a quick summary here. What we've been talking about is this ecological relevance thing. Now what we're going to be talking about is both the anatomical evidence for anatomical and functional distinctiveness. And we're going to concentrate at least first on this functional distinctiveness of face processing to see if it is supportive of this idea of modules. Okay, so our game. The question is, oh boy, I can't see. Hold on just a second. I have trouble seeing the. Okay. So the question is, there's things all over the screen now. The question is, out of these two images, and I realize these are very similar looking images. Okay. I'm sorry about this. Who is older, the person on the top or the person on the bottom? And if you want, you can take a little note of that somewhere, because you're going to see a bunch of these. I'm going to ask you questions about them, and I'm going to then give you what the responses are typically. So who's older, the person on top, the person on bottom? And I know these are very subtly different images. Who's more attractive, the person on top or the person on bottom? Okay. Who's more masculine, the person on top or the person on the bottom? Who's happier, the person on top or person on the bottom? Okay. If you're like most people, the answer, so here you are again, you're seeing the exact same things again. You're seeing who's older, the person on top or the person on bottom, more attractive, that sort of thing. If you're like most people, you would probably have responded that the image on top was the typified the age, attractiveness, gender, and expression characteristic, right? So the person on top looked older. The person on the top looked more attractive. The person on top looked more masculine, and the person on top looked happier. That's what most people say. Why is that the case? Well, it should be obvious that these are, in fact, the same person, okay, on top and on bottom, but they are reversed, okay? Now, the way these people's images are created is the following. They are created using a technique called chimeric faces. Chimeric faces here mean that the left side of the face and right side of the face is actually of different people, okay? So let me see, let me get a good example here. In this image of age, okay, the left side, and when I'm circling here what I mean by left, okay, the left side of this face was actually made by taking a picture not of a single person, but actually a bunch of people who were a little bit older, right? And they were then superimposed on each other. The other side of the face was created by, so this would be the right side of the face, taking a picture of a bunch of people, okay, taking a bunch of different pictures of people who are a little bit younger, and then superimposing them on top of each other. So now you have a left side of the face that's a composite based on older people, and a right side of the face that's a composite based on younger people. And you're able to do a nice job smoothing everything out so it looks like a single face. Cool. So that's how these are created. In fact, that's exactly how this is done here. The left side is taken from a group of people that's more attractive than the right side. I think on this one, the left side is taken from a bunch of pictures of men, and the right side is taken for a bunch of pictures of women. And here's somebody smiling in the same way. Left side, people smiling, right side, not people smiling. Okay, those are chimeric faces. So the composites are different. Composite just means adding a bunch of photos together. The composites are different for the left side and the right side. Cool. Now, that same picture is then shown in the bottom part of each of these pairs, but it's reversed. So this is just the mirror image of that. So here's the attractive. This is just, the bottom picture is just the mirror image of the top picture. So why does the top picture seem to typify that characteristic more than the bottom picture? And hopefully it did for many of you. Okay, I'm just seeing if, okay, some people thought the bottom, okay, that's fine, don't worry about it. You know, it's kind of, you take the big data here, you know, when I do this in the classroom during normal times, more people raise their hand and they say, yeah, for the most part, it seemed like the top picture was typifying that characteristic more than the bottom picture. And if you did it, you know, when you do this in the laboratory, it seems to be the case. So why would that be the case? By the way, what we're talking about now here are subjects that are right-handed. Okay, so for those of you that had the opposite effect, I'd be very interested to know if you're left-handed, but that's okay. Even if you are right-handed and have the opposite effect, you know, it doesn't work with everybody. These are kind of big data patterns we're looking at. Cool. So why would, if this is just a mirror image of this, right? Why would the one on top be more, I guess, you know, characteristic of an older person, a more attractive person, a male and somebody smiling? Why would that be the case? Well, as it turns out, when we look at a face, if we are right-handed, we typically look more to the left side of the face from our perspective, the left side of the face, than the right side of the face. Okay. So we are more sensitive, being right-handed, those of us that are right-handed, we are more sensitive to the left side of the face from the observer's perspective. Let's make just also the reason I'm saying observer is because, I'm talking about this side of the face. If you're actually the face, it's the other way around. But from the observer's perspective, okay, when we look at a face, we are more sensitive to the characteristics on the left side of that face than on the right side. And that's why you get this sort of effect. When we look at this face, we're looking here to the left side, and that's made of people that are older. When we look at this bottom panel, we look to the left side in the face, and that's made of people that are younger, just because it's been reversed, right? Same thing here. Maybe it's most conspicuous here when we look to the left side of the face. I'm sorry, we look at this face. We are more sensitive to the left side of the face, and that's where the smile is being shown, right? When we look at this one down here, okay, again, we're looking to the left side of the face, and there's less of a smile there, clearly. And to most people, the top image looks happier than the bottom image, assuming you're right-handed. And we'll talk about why that's the case in just a second. So it does determine things like age and attractiveness and gender and expression. Okay. In each of these cases, the image on top would be the more typical answer for subjects that are right-handed. And it also seems to be true when it comes to recognizing faces. Okay. And here's a little demonstration of this. When we recognize faces, we seem to put more weight on the left side of the face than the right side of the face. Who's that? Maybe you know, okay? Maybe you know. I wouldn't, but maybe some of you know. Versus who's that? Ah, now you probably know. It is, in fact, Johnny Depp, okay? And how were these images created? These ones on the side. Clearly, what's going on here is this is the same face, but it's the left side of the face then doubled to make the full face here. So basically, you chop Johnny in half this way vertically. You take this side of his face, and then you do a mirror image, and so you're doubling the left side of the face. You're doubling this side of the face. On the other hand, for this image, what you're doing is you're taking Johnny's left side of his face and making a mirror image. So you're doubling the left side of the face. And I think most of us would say that this looks more like Johnny Depp, the one on the left here, than the one here. Why? It's because when we look at Johnny's face, we look at his left side of the face to kind of characterize who he is. Now, we all have, a little asymmetry in our face, right? We talked about that. It's a subtle asymmetry, right? Johnny Depp, big handsome movie star. If he has a little asymmetry, then it's fine if you do. When we talked before about, big asymmetries having, indicating something about genetic health, we weren't talking about these subtle asymmetries. All of us have asymmetries, and that asymmetry is interesting because it kind of demonstrates that we look more at the left side of the face. So hopefully for most of you that are right-handed, you think that this looks more like Johnny Depp than this does. Okay. Why is this the case? Oops. Yeah, here's some more. Sorry. So exact same thing as with Johnny. Here's a picture of the person. Oh, wait, no, I apologize. This is a picture of the person. The question is, does this look more like them or does this? So this is the original picture, the one on the left. This is a doubling of one side, it looks like. Yeah, this is a doubling of the left side, and this is a doubling of the right side. Which of these two look more like the original person? And for me, it's definitely this one, right? And this is actually a doubling of the left side of her face. So it seems to work there. I can't remember where I got these from, but it was nice that they had them. This is the original image. Does this look more like the original, or does this? And I think for me, again, this looks more like the original, and it is in fact the doubling of the left side of the face. So this is, more similar because when I look at her face as a right-handed viewer, I'm looking at the left side of her face. Okay. couple more of these. This is the original. Which of these images looks more like the person? And it is, to me, again, this one looks very much more like this than this one does of that. So, oh, one more, the kid. Okay. Yeah, I guess the middle one looks more like the original, which is a doubling of the left side, than the one here on the right, which is a doubling of the right side. So why is this the case? Why is it the case? Okay, let me see what you're all chatting about here. Saying the second one to me. This makes me feel a lot better about myself because I only love this left side of my face. Great. The one on the right to me looked more like Johnny. Okay, so everyone's got kind of an example that, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. What if you're ambidextrous? Okay, let's talk about left-handers in just a second and ambidextrous people. Okay, yeah, so we're all kind of commenting if we're showing deviations from these typical effects. That's fine. It's it's not going to work for everybody, but when you look at the big data, it works really, really well. So why is this the case? Why, at least in the big data, do you see these differences? And it does have to do with your brain, because you may have learned this in other classes, that for those of us that are right-handed, now we're looking down on a brain, there does seem to be an advantage, maybe a greater sensitivity to facial information in the right hemisphere, the right sides of our brain, relative to the left side of our brain. Okay, so these are what we call asymmetries. In this case, for face perception, we see an advantage for detecting facial information in the right side of our brains versus the left side of our brain. And because of the way the eyes and the visual system is configured, when we're looking at an image, that makes us more sensitive to the left side of that image than the right side of that image, because we look at Johnny Depp here. Okay, the left side of his face gets to the right side of our brain. You might remember this from your intro class, is that images that go to the right side of the brain. Okay, I'm sorry, are the images that are the left part of an image out in the world goes to the right side of our brain. Remember that crossing that occurs for vision? And so if the right side of our brain is more sensitive to faces, then it would be the left side of the face that would be what we're more sensitive to. So the perceptual right hemisphere has an advantage for faces, right? And we find that, in fact, yeah, through research that's done in the laboratory, where faces are shown to people quick enough so you really don't have a chance to move your head or anything. Typically in these sort of experiments, people are shown faces on computer screens and their heads are stabilized by some sort of brace or something. And your image of Johnny Depp comes up there quickly enough so you're not moving your eyes that much. And you're asked something about Johnny Depp's face. And because the right side of your brain is more sensitive to the left side, you're going to do better with the information that's on the left side. So this is called laterality research. Don't worry too much about the technical term. It's just research where it's perceptual research where people are being shown images so that part of the image gets to the right side of the brain, part of the image gets to the left side of the brain. It's a very simple thing to do. You just kind of have to make sure people aren't moving their heads very much. And that research suggests that, yeah, we are more sensitive to the left side of a face, very likely because we have more sensitivity in processing faces in the right side of our brain. Also, prosopagnosia. So I can't remember if we talked about this at all, but you've probably heard about this somewhere along the lines. It certainly makes the popular press often. These are individuals who seem to have a very idiosyncratic sort of disability. It's a disability in recognizing faces, right? So maybe from some sort of traumatic brain injury. Often it happens after somebody has a stroke. If somebody has a stroke, for example, and the stroke happens to be in their right hemisphere, the damage seems to be in the right hemisphere, around the area we consider useful for faces. It's called the fusiform gyrus. Don't worry too much about that, but there's an area there. If it's in their right hemisphere, then we can predict that, yeah, they might have trouble recognizing faces. And it often is the case if it's right there in that area. And it is a problem. So they have trouble recognizing, the faces of celebrities that they knew before they had the stroke, pictures of friends. Maybe even when they first see a friend, they might not recognize them. There's compensation things they can do. They can, wait till the person talks. They can use the person's kind of style of walking. They can use the person's style of dress to kind of determine these things, but also family members, the same sort of thing. So people that do have prosopagnosia, have trouble recognizing faces, do have compensations. But they do have trouble recognizing, certainly recognizing faces from photographs, including photographs of themselves. And you've probably heard of this sort of thing before. There is a book by Oliver Sacks years ago that I think still read in classes sometimes, called the Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, where he wasn't able to recognize his wife. Kind of a very kind of startling sort of effect. As I said, there are compensatory sorts of things that people do, but from photographs, they will always have a problem being able to at least consciously recognize who that person is. And again, when we see somebody who has prosopagnosia, we can infer that they have right hemisphere damage from their stroke, and that's something that can be confirmed through various types of imaging. Okay, again, suggesting that, yeah, there's an anatomical specialization for face perception, and it probably has to do with something in the right hemisphere. Yeah, so this is again confirmed by imaging research, and it's the fusiform gyrus. You're not going to be quizzed on that term, but for those of you that are fans of the brain, right? If you're interested in this sort of thing. Okay, actually, yeah, you probably should know this term, come to think about it, but it's one of the few anatomical terms that you'll have to know, because we will be talking about it in just a second when we discuss multisensory perception of this sort of thing. But it does kind of support the idea that there is this anatomical specialization for faces potentially, which we will be addressing a few other times in our discussion. But let's talk about this kind of functional specialization in another form now. And so I have another little demonstration for you. Who are these people? Yeah, the kind of old pictures. They're also kind of, I think you might know these folks. They still are, you still see the images, and maybe by now you can figure out who they are, but it would be so much easier for you to determine that that was Jack Nicholson when you're seeing it upright, and that's Hillary Clinton when you're seeing it upright, right? And it just pops up to you, I think, that it is so much easier to recognize a face when it is shown in an upright orientation than when it is shown in an inverted, in an upside down orientation. And that seems to be the case for faces, but not things that aren't faces. We'll talk about this in some detail in a second. So we're able to recognize dogs just as well, or a breed of dog just as well, as if it's upside down or right side up. But there seems to be something disproportionately inhibiting about upside down faces, which is interesting, right? And it's another type of functional specialization that seems to occur for faces, called the facial inversion effect. Now, there's somebody who's been back in the news after years and years, Monica Lewinsky, because of, I don't know if you've watched the TV show that is portraying her and her relationship with Linda Tripp, and what happened with her and President Clinton. But it's just, I'm just using her as an example, and she has there's a very striking difference between, in this image, her inversion and her upright configuration. But what this inversion effect says is that inverting a face, turning it upside down, disproportionately inhibits one's ability to recognize a face. Okay, so again, what I mean by disproportionately is when you invert an image of a house, invert an image of a dog, invert an image of anything, a musical instrument or something like that, you can still recognize it almost as well as when it's upright. That doesn't seem to be the case for faces. It seems disproportionately affected by inversion for some reason, okay? Now, the reason people have thought this might be the case is that for faces, we actually do more than the usual recognition through features. Okay, so to recognize Monica Lewinsky, to recognize Hillary Clinton or Jack Nicholson, we probably look at the features to some degree. We look at the shape of the mouth, the shape of the eyes, that sort of thing. That's how we would recognize a musical instrument. We recognize the features of, say, a guitar's right. You can't see the guitar good because of this. It's driving me nuts. Okay. Yeah, there we go. So you recognize the, this aspect of it, the head, the tuning pegs, these sort of things, the strings, the body, all that. And that's the case, whether it's upright or upside down or whatever. We're going to be recognizing it feature by feature. And the same thing's true of faces. But it's thought that when we recognize faces, we actually use another type of analysis. We use an analysis that involves looking at the features' position relative to each other. So, how high are the eyes relative to the nose? How high is the nose relative to the mouth? How high is the mouth relative to the chin? How far apart are the eyes? How far apart are the sides of the face? In other words, we look not just at the features, we look at the holistic, or sometimes it's called configural information. Holistic is fine, though. We're looking at how the features are related to each other. And that separate analysis is thought to only occur for faces. That we really don't, when we look at a guitar, spend much time analyzing the distance between the top of the head of the guitar and the bottom of the head, or how far the head is above the neck part of the guitar or something like that. That kind of holistic analysis, that type of analysis where we're looking at the configuration of the features relative to each other, is thought to really only occur for faces. And that might be what makes face recognition and expression recognition and attractiveness recognition and all these different things so efficient, right? We talked about that we can do these things subliminally. We can recognize faces and real, kind of details of a face subliminally. That might be because the brain goes through not just a featural analysis, but a holistic analysis, and it does so spontaneously. And what happens when you invert the face, okay, when you turn the face upside down, is you basically prevent the analysis, you prevent the processing of that holistic information, right? It's considered, this holistic analysis is considered to be specific to faces. And it is considered that inversion inhibits this. So the advantage we have with faces might be based on this extra type of processing we do. And if you want to show that this processing is important, you invert a face and show it to somebody, and that person can no longer use this kind of configuration information, the holistic information, to perceive the faces, these sort of features relative to each other. Okay, so inversion inhibits this holistic analysis, right? And I have one other example of this that I think is a fun one. It's called the Margaret Thatcher effect. I don't know if you know who Margaret Thatcher was. She was the Prime Minister of England back in the 80s. There was a movie with Meryl Streep where she played Margaret Thatcher, very controversial figure, but quite a character. And back in the 80s, when she was prime minister, some perceptual psychologists came up with this demonstration and happened to use her face because she was in the news at the time, of course. And now it's come to be known as the Margaret Thatcher effect. So here's Margaret Thatcher, and I'm going to show you a picture of her upside down, or two images of her upside down, right? If I asked you to look at these, you say, yeah, I see a difference. There seems to be something going on with her eyes maybe, and her mouth, but it didn't pop out at you. I'm now going to reinvert. I'm going to make these images upright, and look how quickly it comes out, right? Again, it seems that we are disproportionately sensitive to upright faces. And that could be because we are doing this kind of parallel featural and holistic analysis of the face. And then when we see the face upside down, we can't do the holistic analysis anymore. And it becomes much harder to be able to pick things out. So what I've been suggesting might be a specialization for faces, okay? Through the facial attractiveness characteristics, the facial expression characteristics, really might be for upright faces, which is kind of interesting, I think, right? It really might be for upright faces. Okay, let's continue. Then we'll take a little break and do some questions at the end. So what we are discussing now is the fact that there does seem to be evidence, not only for the critical ecological adaptive importance of faces, but the anatomical now and functional distinctiveness, which we've discussed in the context of these kind of chimeric faces, and looking at the left side of the face because the right side of the brain and its fusiform gyrus is what's involved here. And then this functional distinctiveness, where it seems that for processing of faces, we might use this kind of extra type of analysis that not just looks at the features, but looks at the features relative to each other. Right, and we've already talked about no conscious awareness, the process of cognitive impenetrability. What we're going to talk about next is the fact that we can perceive faces from a modality, a sensory system other than vision. But I guess I should probably do our question here. I think I can ask this before going into the next slide. Let's take a quick look here. Let me just look at this question before I do anything else. Yes. Okay. So let me see your chat questions before we do this. My reasoning for choosing the left as left, I purposely prefer the left because I am lefty with a righty world in a righty world. Okay, thank you, Jenna. That's interesting. Paulina says she's also in the newest season of The Crown. Who is Monica Lewinsky? She's an actress in the newest season of The Crown? Oh, Margaret Thatcher. Thank you. Yes. Portrayed wonderfully by Gillian Anderson. Yeah, it's great. And it's a really interesting portrayal. So if you're a fan of The Crown, that's a great thing. Thank you for reminding me. Monica Lewinsky's an actress? Yeah, that's great. It's a great example. Thank you. Okay, chimeric faces. Research testing chimeric, these split mirror image faces, stimuli show that for right-handed perceivers, the halo effect works only with chimeric faces. Remember the halo effect, you learned about it before. Does it work only with chimeric faces? Okay. The halo effect does not work with infants. Okay. Does that have anything to do with chimeric faces? All right. Or is it even true? C, the right side of a face from the perceiver's perspective determines judgments of age, gender, and expression. Or D, the left side of a face from the perceiver's perspective determines judgments of age, gender, and expression. And I'll give you a chance to go ahead and answer that. And I realize we're coming close to the end of our session, so I'll make sure we have time to go over the answer. Okay, I'll give you another 10 seconds on this one to make sure we can go through the answer. And most of you are getting this no problem because we just went through it. The correct answer is, in fact, D. It is the left side of the face from the perceiver's perspective, and we're talking about right-handed people now, that determines judgments of age, gender, and expression. That is the correct answer, D. Now, I didn't have a chance before to say anything about left-handed or ambidextrous people. There is some evidence of reversal, but the reversal is not as clear-cut. In fact, left-handed and ambidextrous people might not have as much of a specialization in one hemisphere. Rather, it seems to be, to some degree, spread a little bit more. So there is some reversal for you left-handed and ambidextrous folks, okay? But it doesn't seem as kind of clear cut for you as well. Okay, sorry about that going a little long. We will continue we'll finish up our discussion of faces on Tuesday. Bye-bye.